try to avoid these days. I was at a meeting about Foucault a couple of weeks ago in Philadelphia with a chap called Mark Poster, whose work may be familiar to some of you. And actually, I felt a little bad about Mark Poster because I'd reviewed a book of his in a somewhat flippant way some time earlier, accusing him of being a member of the sportscasting school of the history of ideas. But I said then that just pursuing that somewhat corny imagery that anybody seen with a big S after 1968 was booed off the field, something did happen to structuralism, so the title of my talk is Whatever Did. But 68 was only 17 years ago, and before I knew what was going to happen, I did at that time write an article called What is Structuralism? As I'll tell you later, that wasn't the title I wanted for it, but because I'd just come across it a couple of years earlier, and it was a really sort of heady structuralist time. There had been, for example, that meeting at Johns Hopkins in 1966, the proceedings of which were published as, what is it, something or other in the Sciences of Man, do you remember Structuralist Controversy in the Sciences of Man, something like that, by Donato and Maxi. There had been in 1966 a meeting in France I went to on a quite different topic where I met a number of young French philosophers, all of whom were talking about structuralism. And one of them, in fact, since she found out that I came from America, asked me whether I was a positivist, and I said, no, actually not. And she said, a Marxist then? And I said, no, actually not that either. And she said, donc vous êtes structuraliste, and walked off. I mean, so that was how her world sort of segmented itself at the time. And I got really intrigued by what seemed to be going on in French philosophy outside French philosophy, let's say not in philosophy departments, but in other places altogether. Obviously, the great guru at the time was Lévi-Strauss. And I spent some time reading in all those peripheral domains: anthropology, psychoanalysis, Marxism, literary criticism, linguistics, history, Russian formalism, all that stuff. And it was a tremendous time. I got very excited, and I thought it was important, and I still do. And first of all, I want to tell you why I thought it was important then and why I think it's important now, and then go on to what happened to it. And I suppose partly I should I'll be just very slightly autobiographical, only by telling you that my early training was in physics, and that when I got into philosophy, I was in the philosophy of science, and I got tremendously interested in the whole question of scientific theories and their structure, and began to ask whether one couldn't take what was learned about the structure of theory in the natural sciences and apply it elsewhere. And the second book that Peter referred to, Science and the Theory of Value, was an attempt to do that for value theory, but there were some things that didn't seem to work terribly well. That is, having a theory of the physical world seemed to be all right, and the work I did in that book on value theory pushed the thing all the way to the other end, that is to say, supplementing what one knows about the physical world with subjective desires, but there's a whole middle ground that leaves out, and it's the ground essentially covered by the social sciences, or what the French would call the sciences humaines. And there's a big problem, or was at that time, has been in a standard kind of way, I suppose, about how to regard the social sciences. I touched on it a little bit last night. One doesn't want to extend positivism into the social sciences because there's clearly something else going on. What's going on has something to do with the condition of the subject, but there are so many subjects in the social sciences, so many individual subjects, that it's not easy to generalize from that either. I had been exposed, in spite of myself, to Sartre at that time, because when I first started teaching philosophy, I met a group of enthusiastic students who begged me to read the Existentialists with them. They had just heard of existentialism in the Middle West in 1957. That's a 12-year cultural lag, and it takes a while for these things to happen. That we should still be talking about structuralism here no doubt seems curious to some of our friends on the continent. But nobody else in the department would read with them. I was in the philosophy of science, as I said, and logic and things like that, and I said no, I wouldn't do either, but they begged and promised to buy the beer and so on. So we did have a little seminar once a week reading Hazel Barnes's translation of Sartre and what there was of Heidegger and so on. And I must say it made an irreversible difference to my own philosophical career. So there was this sense I had of a potential connection between the existential side on the one hand and the sort of realist philosophy of science side on the other. And then there was the question of scientific theory itself, because it soon occurred to me, as it had obviously occurred to lots of other people before, but this is the autobiographical bit which will soon end, that scientific theory itself is not something we get from the world, it's something we get out of our heads. Scientific theories are human creations, and they're imaginative creations. You can't do it inductively. The inductive thing doesn't work. Even Bacon didn't think the inductive thing worked. I don't know how many of you were here yesterday at Hugh Kenner's lecture, but he talked a little bit about Bacon, and there's something quite remarkable about Bacon, who was known as an inductivist for the first volume of the Novum Organum, but in the second volume becomes what we would now quite clearly call a hypothetico-deductive philosopher of science, because he talks about what he calls the indulgence of the understanding, the first vintage, that is when the mind is making hypotheses, can't help making hypotheses, and you have to allow it to make hypotheses, and that's how he got the striking results he did. It is quite true, as you kind of said, that Bacon was not the, to revert to my sportscasting imagery, the ball carrier for the history of science at that time. That went by Galileo and Descartes, but for entirely other reasons, and Bacon was, in fact, a perfectly genial philosopher of science, and he was, he did understand that induction wasn't the source of hypotheses, but that the human, creative human imagination was. Structuralism seemed to me at that time a way of getting a grip on the social sciences, or the sciences humaines, that avoided any kind of borrowed positivism, avoided an uncritical subjectivism, and avoided the postulation of any independent objectivity in the objects it talked about. And so how did it manage that? Well, what I take structuralism to be is, on the one hand, a philosophical view, and on the other hand, a critical method. The view is that the reality of the objects of the social or human sciences is relational rather than substantial. And I mean not even hypothetically substantial. When I say relational rather than substantial, I mean that the structures with which the social sciences deal are sets of relations. They're sets of relations which, to go on to the sort of Levi-Straussian part of it, are mutually transforming within certain groups, and they are relations also which are sustained by human intentionalities. There's a question that arises, and this is a question in philosophy generally, and a question that has lots of other kinds of answers. Are relations prior to things, or are things prior to relations? Because after all, the extensional definition of a relation is a set of pairs of objects, and that you have the things first, and the relation is just whatever happens to subsist between them. But there are some things, obviously, which seem to be constituted out of the relations. I'll probably come back to that. But one way of thinking of the difference between the natural sciences and the social sciences that's sort of hidden in that question is to think, let's say, of Newton in 1666, looking at the apple and then looking at the moon and realizing that the moon is doing just what the apple's doing. The moon is falling, and it's falling by the same laws that the apple is falling by. It's just that it has this headlong forward speed as well, which prevents it ever from hitting the earth, but it's falling the whole time. That's what gravity is. But one might say that the apple and the earth and the moon exist independently, and gravitation can be seen as a relation that holds between them. They are in some way prior to it. One discovers about it by seeing what happens to them. They're independently recognizable. But, for example, if you take a case from the social sciences, let's say money. Money is related to commodities by purchasing power and so on, and manifests itself in the behavior of cashiers and accepting it and so on. And you might think that the money, the cashier, and the commodities all were independently recognizable just the way the apple, the earth, and the moon are. But money isn't independently recognizable. It wouldn't be money if it weren't ever used in a transaction, and if all the cashiers rejected it, then it wouldn't function as money no matter how one protested. Another way of putting the same thing is to say, and I'm not sure whether I said this last night or not, but I'll repeat it quickly anyway, that relations in the physical sciences I would want to call causal or quasi-causal and say that they are mind-independent, but that by and large relations in the social sciences are mind-dependent. That is, apart from the biological relations between parents and children, which, by the way, when you think of it, are extremely short-lived. I mean, the biological relation between a man and his child is very, very short-lived, and just has to do with active generation. The biological relation between a mother and her child lasts a little longer, but ends at weaning. Thereafter, relations between parents and children are social. And if they aren't sustained by the parents, or the children for that matter, then they don't exist. That is to say, if parents disown their children or children reject their parents, then there's a sense in which those family relations cease to exist, even though you can sort of look back and say, well, actually these people are in relations such that it might be sustained, would be plausibly sustained by this social attitude, but for the moment isn't. And there are lots of relations like that, and there are property relations, there are relations between persons and texts and so on, which when you come to think of it would not subsist at all unless they were sustained. Now the method that structuralism generates is a method of inquiring into and specifying the sets of relations or structures that constitute the objects of the social sciences, or into which they enter, and that's an important thing to notice. I mean, there are relations that constitute things, but there are also relations into which things so constituted enter with other things, so there's a hierarchical structure of objects and relations, and of looking for groups of objects which are structural transformations of one another. Since I also want to say, and this can be sustained, although it would, maybe we'll get into an argument about it later, I don't know, but I want to claim that the relations which constitute the objects of the social sciences are created and sustained by human subjects, by intentional subjects. And they are, in the world of those intentional subjects, relations that carry significance. It's not surprising to find that the structures dealt with by the social sciences are nearly all structures of significance. I call them, and I don't know anybody else who does, signiferous structures, a word that I like because it comes from an old family of words with that FER ending coming from the verb to bear or carry, but has just the kind of double sense that one wants in a case like this, of bearing in the way that, let's say, Carboniferous strata bear coal. That is, it's reasonable to look for meaning in a signiferous structure, but also bearing in the sense that St. Christopher bore Christ, that is the FER at the end, or PHER in that case, is a bearing of significance, shall we say, from one place to another. That's say these structures can be used for communication, but they're also, as it were, repositories. They can communicate meaning, but they're also repositories of meaning. And because of this fact, it's not surprising that, along with the structuralist activity of specifying the structures in question, there often goes a hermeneutic activity of interpreting them. Now, since it's willing to grant the structures in question the status of intentional objects, roughly in the manner of Brentano, it's clear that structuralism rejects the methodological and anti-metaphysical cautions of positivism and behaviorism. But because it doesn't grant them the status of substantial entries in an ontology independent of human intentions, it's also clear that it's not an essentialist position. The 2 points follow from this. One is, structuralism doesn't require, although it doesn't exclude, the view that there exists some objective or deep generating structure of which the structures it studies are transformations. And one of the things about the structures that structuralism studies is that very often they come in groups which are transformations of one another, like the myths in Lévi-Strauss and so on. So structuralism doesn't require the view, but doesn't exclude the view, that there's some other objective or deep generating structure of these things that transform into one another. Nor does it require, although it's compatible with the view, that the carrier of the structures up to and including the structure of subjectivity itself, or the structure that subjectivity is neurophysiological. Now I'm going to go through those too slowly. Do I have a board? I think well, I just want to do one thing on it. That's all. That's actually two diagrams. The first diagram is just the top line, and the second diagram is the whole thing, but I don't want to draw it again. You imagine that the structuralist method of looking for transformations finds that a structure S1 transforms into a structure S2, transforms into a structure S3, and so on. Sometimes Lévi-Strauss, for example, does this in quite outrageous ways. I mean, if any of you are familiar with the mythologique, what he often does is to, I mean, you can do the following kind of thing. If you have a myth in which an old man goes upriver and is carried away by an eagle to a place of fertility, and there's another myth in which a young woman is born downriver and is captured by a fish and taken to an arid place, these are really the same myth. You know, because all you've got to do is go from young to old, male to female, upriver to downriver, flying to swimming, fertile to arid, and you've got, it's exactly the same structure, right? I mean, and Lévi-Strauss does this quite outrageously very often. You know, and very often you find things that really, for example, if you think of Propp's morphology of folktale or something like that, although that's really a case of the second thing. I mean, suppose you've got a class of things that mutually transform like that. Then you might also find something else which I'm here calling D. First of all, S1, S2, S3 means structure 1 to structure 2 to structure 3, but in the second diagram it means surface structure 1, surface structure 2, surface structure 3, and deep structure. You can imagine somebody postulating a deep structure which is the generating origin of all the surface structures. That's the kind of thing, of course, that Chomskyan linguistics does. And I haven't any objection to this if D itself is an independent candidate for embodiment, which it is in Chomskyan linguistics, but it's not okay if D is just invented. For example, Lévi-Strauss in his early work, seeing all these things transforming into one another, said, well, maybe there's something which we might call the human mind, which is this deep generating structure. Although, I mean, there might be some point to that, let's say if you could specify just how you meant the expression, the idea that there is some sort of objective human mind, objective mind with a capital M, which generates all these things, seems to me quite wrong. But there were a lot of people in the early days of structuralism who spent a lot of time chasing after some basic or deep or even absolute structure, or who made interesting capital out of it in other ways, as Umberto Eco did, for example, with his book called The Absent Structure, because if there isn't one of these things, sometimes you may feel a little bit lost. Now, so that has to do then with the theory and the method, but the third part of what I said before, the third characteristic of structuralism, first being sets of relations, second mutual transformations, and now with this little added twist that you might have a deep generating structure, but third, that these are created and sustained by human subjects, there a terrible problem arises. The early structuralists were preoccupied with the notion of subjectivity rather the way that Sartre is preoccupied with the idea of God. Let's say they didn't believe in it, but they couldn't stop talking about it. There's that wonderful passage in Les Mots when Sartre describes the atheist as this maniac of God who cannot open his mouth without pronouncing his name. That's the way subjectivity was. In every discussion of structuralism in the 1960s, one wound up talking about the subject. There's no room for the subject in the structure as such. The structures are all formal. So an absence of the subject seems to follow. And this leads to remarks that I always found somewhat silly, like Lévi-Strauss's remark that the myths think themselves through us, or something like that, or Foucault's remark that I am written, and so on. The thing is, this really goes back to an old trope in the history of philosophy, Kierkegaard's criticism of Hegel for having forgotten that he was an existential subject. It's true that I depend on structure. I may in some sense be a structure. I mean, my own definition of subjectivity, although I don't have time to go into it, is that subjectivity is the animation of structure, which is very clever because it gets in the word for the soul, but there's nothing theological about that for me. But the fact that I may be in a certain way constituted, for example, in society very often we are constituted by the relations into which we enter, and we normally answer questions about ourselves in those terms, like the people we're connected with, or the work we do, or the name we bear, or whatever it is. But the fact that I depend on these relations doesn't mean that I as a subject vanish. The best you can do, but on the other hand, I don't think there's a philosophical answer, as it were, to the problem of subjectivity. I don't think there's any way in which you can explain the existence of the subject in the sense of referring it to something more fundamental, any more than I think you can explain the existence of the world by referring it to something more fundamental, These seem to me in a way two surds out of which all sense is generated. But what you can do is to look for the conditions under which subjectivity appears, and very often one finds that this is in the context of some structural complexity. But there's always something in structuralism that's lacking if what you want to do is to find your own connection to it or any other subject's connection to it. And in this connection, there's a rather interesting remark in one of Saussure's notebooks towards the end of his life, in which Saussure says, look, I understand language. What I don't understand is how, if a bit of language is pronounced, I can understand that it's directed to me. I don't know, I mean, I can understand the sentences, but I don't know what it is about them that tells me that somebody is addressing me by means of them. And it's as though something extra-linguistic is always required. And I think it probably is, you know, and one finds out that things are addressed to one. Because you see, just the fact that my name is used or something like that is not enough. Even if some invocation is used, some apostrophe is used, that's not enough, because that could just be a linguistic device, and it could be in a novel or whatever, and it not really be meant as an address to me. And Saussure is, as it were, suggesting that there's some supplement required which he doesn't know how to provide. The structures, if you think of subjectivity as the animation of structure, you might want to ask what sort of structures subjectivity animates. And I want to say it starts by animating bodily structures, but winds up animating texts very often. We do borrow. We're tremendous consumers of structure, it seems to me. And what reading is, in a way, is the internalization of a borrowed structure, which we then provisionally animate. And it's quite instructive to notice that when we're doing that, the normal structures of the bodily and kind of environmental structures we normally animate often turn out to be put out of play, so that you can be lost in reading. Or the expression that I like the best in this connection, you can be buried in a book. To be buried in a book is, in a sense, to be dead to the world other than the world of the book, dead and buried, as it were. And yet, obviously, in the borrowed structure that you've taken in from whatever it is you're reading, you're perfectly animated and entering into those relationships. So we temporarily borrow sets of relationships constantly, largely from texts, and that's part of what our life consists of. But there you have to be very careful not to think that the text is the agent of this borrowing, or that the writer somehow is injecting himself into it. This is perfectly voluntary. If I decide to read something and lose myself in its structure, or that is to say borrow its structure and, as it were, lose the normal structures I'm animating, that's something I do to myself, and it's something that I have to have the apparatus to be able to do. In fact, it's a kind of form of intoxication. There's a wonderful little text that Lévi-Strauss wrote for the Smithsonian Institution in about 1940 called The Tribes of the Upper Xingu River. That's Xingu. And in this he describes the habits of these tribes, one of which was to be stoned a great deal of the time because they smoked something or other. I don't know what it was, but stuff they found down there and knew how to prepare. And when they smoked, they called this process seeing smoking. And seeing smoking was obviously smoking and getting visions. And one day Lévi-Strauss was reading a letter from Paris, and somebody said, "What's that?" And he said, "It's a letter from Paris." And they said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "Well, this tells me what my family is doing in Paris." And they said, "Aha, seeing smoking. That's what he's doing." And indeed, one might say that reading is just such a form of intoxication. I sometimes think that, the more reprehensible kinds of intoxication are analog intoxication, whereas reading is a kind of digital intoxication. But still, one of the things we do with our subjective life is to borrow structures in that way. Now, I'm going to get to what happened to structuralism, but obviously what the structuralists like Lévi-Strauss and the others talked about were social structures. And if we think of human beings as persons rather than just as biological specimens, it's quite clear that their lives are very largely relational. Like I said this before, we're in metabolic relations with the environment too, and if we're deprived of social relations, various forms of depression ensue. If we're deprived of other sensory relations, even psychosis can set in, as in those nice little boxes you can get in with warm glycerin that are dark and anechoic and so and it's fine for a little while, but then you begin to lose your grip. The fact that in society a great many things we think of as substantial are really relational get shown up in interesting ways. For example, one of the most striking is the fact that in primitive societies, twins pose a terrific problem, because twins are two people in the same structural relations to all the others. Normally, there's a sort of clear sort of birth order and so on, and different things have happened between the birth of one and the other things in the family and so on. But with twins, you've got two non-differentiated entities occupying the same structural niche, as it were. So the Bushmen of the Kalahari used to kill twins. That's the easiest way to get rid of that anomaly in the structure. The Ashanti used to give them to the king, because the king was sort of hors catégorie, didn't have to enter into the same relationships. And the Ndembu, and it's from Victor Turner's book on the Ndembu that I get these examples, practiced an elaborate ritual of differentiation, after which the twins were two different people, had different relations in the society. And one might go on to talk about the self in a deeper sense as being structural, as is shown very often by psychoanalytic work. I mean, it's remarkable how what people are tends to depend on relations with the primary family and so on and so on. Anyway, I won't go into all the branches of structuralism, but my claim is that they're all doing that kind of thing, although with different contents. So I could go on like that, but now it's time to talk about what happened. But everybody got bored with structuralism. It was quickly old hat. I think it was discarded by the French, at least, before they had fully understood it. That's one of the reasons. One of the difficulties is particularly French problem. This was fashionable, it was exciting, it was verbose, it was sloppy, it was impatient. People didn't ever really bother, I think, to work out carefully what they had. They went on to new fashions, which they called post-structuralism, curiously enough, as if something had to be happening all the time. That's another bit of the sportscasting view. I remember, the things moved very quickly. I once had to comment on a paper of Foucault's at Buffalo. He was coming to talk at a structuralist conference. And I didn't know what Foucault was thinking about at the time, and he wasn't there, unfortunately, until very shortly before the paper, and I hadn't been given a copy of it, and all the other commentators had papers. I had nothing at all. And Foucault came in about an hour before the meeting, and I stopped him on the way down the aisle and said, you've got to tell me what you're going to talk about. And he said, Nietzsche. And I was simply not prepared for Foucault to be talking about Nietzsche, but there had been a recent new translation. Foucault was all excited about Nietzsche, and it was all right, because there were things one could say in a Foucaultian and generally structuralist vein about what happened when people turned their attention to, what is an author after all? Not just the Foucault question, what's an author, but what historically a body of work and that kind of thing. But then there was, Paris is a very exciting place, and one of the things that happened was that the Telquel people discovered Charles Sanders Peirce. That was pretty exciting, and immediately they moved into semiotics, which had been going on elsewhere under different names, but it becomes more exciting when the Telquel people do it. They shortly dropped that and went on to become Maoists and eventually right-wing Christians, but one of the things to be reckoned with in these movements is that they do move in this fast kind of way and get left behind. The second thing is that May 1968 came along, just after I'd written this article I told you about at the beginning. Structuralism was seen by the revolutionaries of May 68 as anti-humanist, because it seemed to be an attempt to bring under scientific constraints something whose essence was the immediate experience of feeling, family, literature, and so on. The career of Roland Barthes is illustrative in this way. Towards the end of his life, Barthes wrote, I believed, or I really wanted to believe, in a science of discourse. But I don't know, as one gets older, perhaps one becomes, in contrast to what they say, more liberal. Science seems to me less desirable. More and more I'm sensitive to the pleasure of the text, not to its law. And there was something like that went on, that people found that, some of the structuralists were, particularly Levi-Strauss, I guess, actually fairly desiccated. And I think, of course, the structuralists should have, in a certain way, have embraced that. What I wanted to call my article, Partisan Review in 1968, was Structuralism is not a humanism. And I wanted to call it that as an echo of Sartre's paper in 1947, Existentialism is a humanism, because there's something wrong with humanism because it makes something rather complicated the basis of explanation of things that need perhaps something less complicated as their basis. Do I really want to unpack that? Perhaps not, but I will tell you an anecdote. But in this article in '68, I adapted a motto of Terence, which everybody knows, homo sum nihil me alienum puto, something like that. Nihil humanum, sorry, homo sum, that's the essential part. Homo sum nihil humanum me alienum puto. I'm a man, nothing human is to be said to be alien to me. And I said it would be much better to say homo sum nihil. That is to say, not just human things aren't alien. Nothing's alien to me if I'm a man, if I'm human, excuse me, because humans are the kinds of beings who can, as it were, take on the whole universe. And you know, it's an extraordinary thing, but up to a point, it puts limitations on the universe they can take on, of course, but that sort of is... but that goes without saying, in the sense that you couldn't you can't get beyond what you can get beyond, as it were. Anyway, this original article was translated into Italian, and the translator, who was Giorgio Cardona, a man whom I've never met, although I'd love to, decided that this was by an ignorant American who didn't know Terence, so he put the humanum back in, which spoiled the point entirely. I mean, I don't know how many of you know where that motto comes from, and it's an old, nice humanist motto, but actually it's a wonderful structural example. It's an example of bricolage, high bricolage, because actually it comes from an entirely inappropriate source. It comes from a play, The Self-Tormentor, in which there's this really objectionable person who's always meddling in other people's affairs. And somebody says to him, Cremes, you know, do you have so much time? Don't you have your own things to do? You're always meddling in other people's affairs. And he says, sanctimoniously, I'm a man. Nothing human is alien to me. I mean, I take an interest in your affairs. But of course, it's become, in the history of humanism in the West, transformed into a kind of high motto. You know, I'm a man. Nothing human is alien to me. So that was May '68, which was a political reaction to something that was seen as anti-humanist. But there was also the fact that there were many structuralisms, naturally because there were a good many social sciences, and some of them were ideological. Althusser, for example, seemed to be using structuralism along with his friends as a vehicle for a kind of communist propaganda. And if you read why Raymond Aron at the time was vehemently anti-structuralist, it was because he was anti-Althusser, because he was anti-left. The word, in any case, was a word that had its ambiguities because there was an American structuralism in linguistics associated with the behaviorist linguists like Bloomfield. So Chomsky was vehemently anti-structuralist, but because he didn't want to be called a structuralist linguist, because being called a structuralist linguist in American context meant something quite different. And there was altogether too much of the fashionable aspect, too much of the bandwagon, and so some people just wanted to avoid that. And Foucault, for example, became apoplectic if you called him a structuralist. And in the introduction to The Order of Things in English, he says, I've been unable to get it into people's tiny minds that I have never practiced any of the methods of structuralism. But actually, Foucault was one of the very best structuralists, and Les Mots et les Choses seems to me as a first-rate example of structuralist work. But it always seemed to me that away from all this turmoil and fashion, it might be possible to do some real work on it, and that's why I continue to think it important. And there are interesting connections and interesting anticipations of kind that even the semioticians didn't catch. For example, in Peirce, there's a wonderfully structuralist little passage, but it's under the name of phaneroscopy. Phaneroscopy was Peirce's name for what later came to be called phenomenology. That is, phaneroscopy is the description, the looking at, the inspection of whatever appears. Peirce's name for the totality of what appears is the phaneron. And Peirce says, look, if you want to identify something in what appears, but you don't have any underlying theory to which to refer it, it's a kind of true phenomenology, all you can do is to define it in terms of what he calls its valences. That is to say, to define it in terms of its relations to other things. And this is exactly like a Saussurean exercise in the building up of language out of arbitrary matchings. You know, Saussure says somewhere, language is a system of differences with no positive terms. And that's exactly the way that Peirce is looking at the phaneron. There's also Ernst Cassirer, whose work on the symbolic forms would have been the manifesto of structuralism if he hadn't been as piously Kantian as he was. Anyway, that's what I think happened to structuralism, but I don't think it was fatal, and I think there's still room for work. What about deconstruction? That's to say, after what happened to structuralism, what kind of work might one want to do? Now, deconstruction, it seems to me, is a wonderful example of the sportscasting mentality. To call deconstruction post-structuralist seems to me just silly, because I think deconstruction is something that follows exactly, if you think of it, from the premises of structuralism itself. And I'll try to make that point clear by saying the following. Language is tremendously dominant in human experience. It's almost the defining characteristic of the human, not only generically, but individually. Somewhere Heidegger says, "I am what I say," and that's something you can take fairly seriously up to a certain point. But something very important about language is the following. Nobody ever just learns a language. Maybe it would be better to say nobody ever just learns a first language. It may conceivably be possible to learn a second language without the constraints that I'm going to mention. Nobody ever just learns a language. Everybody also learns a great many things that are said in that language by those from whom it is learned. That is, by the time you have a language at your disposal, you've also internalized a great many things that the persons who are dominant in your linguistic education believe. The process of learning a language or any relational structure of the kind I'm talking about, I want to call instruction. I sometimes hyphenate that to make the point, although it's a bit corny, but I want to call it instruction for a quite specific reason, because it's a term that takes its place then alongside these other structuralist terms. Instruction meaning for me the construction of something inner. Let's say instruction is a process which means that I come to have the structure of my society, I come to have the structure of my language, I come to have the structure of my university, and so on. I did not make a point before, I'll make it now very briefly, although it again needs a lot more defense. The entities that the social sciences refer to, social structures of one kind or another, I said are created and sustained by human subjects, by the intentionalities of human subjects. I also want to say they're distributed without remainder among those human subjects. They do not exist objectively. Some physical, some material correlates of them exist, what Sartre would have called the practico-inert. But social structures do not exist unless they are internalized by the persons who constitute their terms. If all the speakers of a language die, that language ceases to exist, and it may be recovered, it may be reinvented the way that Provençal was by the Felibrige, for example. It may be reinvented the way classical languages occasionally are. That is to say, there's a bit of the practico-inert, the grammar, the dictionary, texts, and so on, that might be used for a reconstitution of that language. But the language isn't a living language unless there are people who speak it or read it. And the same is true, I think, of all social structures. I mean, the university wouldn't exist if nobody believed it did, the family wouldn't if nobody believed it did, the state wouldn't if nobody believed it did. How difficult it would be to get to the situation where nobody believed it is one of the reasons why institutions are so tenacious of life, because even if we all forgot it, somebody else might remember. But when the last person who knows about a social phenomenon has gone, the social phenomenon has gone too. So I will say that instruction is the acquisition of an inner mental structure. It's idiosyncratic, radically idiosyncratic. I was talking a bit about that last night, but it's still true in all other respects as well. No two people have the same English language, even though many people may agree to abide by the decisions of some reference work or something like that. No two people have quite the same conception of the family to which they belong, or the institution, or the state, or whatever, even though there are practico-inert codifications in the law books and so on of those things as well. This acquisition of inner mental structure goes on wholesale. We swallow complete structures of morality, of politics, of nationalism, and so on, as part of the process of instruction. A lot of that we just take in with the language, but a lot of the rest of it is given to us quite explicitly by those who undertake our instruction. So we wind up with structures, linguistic structures, mental structures, social structures, structures of morality and of religion and of politics and so on. And one of the things we have at some point to do is to look at those structures to see whether we were wise to ingest them quite as wholesale as all that. The father of this enterprise, the paradigm case, is Descartes, who says at the beginning of the Meditations, it struck me the other day that most of the things I've been taught are false. So I think I'd better examine them to see whether they're worth keeping or not. That's a deconstructive activity for me. And it seems to me that the structures which we ingest in this wholesale way may indeed become obstructions, that's another nice word of the same family, to our freedom. So in this family of English words that I've been talking about, structure, instruction, obstruction, there's another word, destruction, which seems fairly obvious, and that's what Descartes is made to use, at least by his English translators at the beginning of it's either the beginning of the Meditations or the beginning of the Discourse on Method. He says, I'll destroy all my former opinions, but it's much better to think of the activity of critical disarticulation of these inherited structures, as it were, like the history of Western metaphysics or the logocentrism of Western philosophy in general, the kind of things that Derrida goes after in his philosophical rather than his purely literary mode. Better to think of this not as a destructive activity, but in the word that Derrida uses, a deconstructive one. I have somewhere here, if I can find it, it seems to have gotten lost, a text from Heidegger, which is the text in whose translation Derrida uses the term deconstruction, although actually Lacan uses it at some even earlier point, and I'm not sure, I mean, I don't know what the absolute beginnings of all this might have been. Heidegger says the following, and what he's saying is, in more complicated language, what I've just been saying. Dasein falls prey to the tradition of which it has more or less explicitly taken hold. This tradition keeps it from providing its own guidance, whether in inquiring or choosing. When tradition becomes master, it does so in such a way that what it transmits is made so inaccessible, proximally and for the most part, that it rather becomes concealed. Here what's being transmitted is good, but it's getting covered up. If the question of being is to have its own history made transparent, then this hardened tradition must be loosened up, and concealments which it has brought about must be dissolved. We understand this task as one in which, by taking the question of being as our clue, we are to destroy, and he emphasizes destroy, the traditional content of ancient ontology until we arrive at those primordial experiences in which we achieved our first ways of determining the notion of being. And this is part of Heidegger's view, as you remember, that philosophy took a wrong turning rather early on, say with Plato, for example, and has been on the wrong track ever since. The history of metaphysics is an obstruction to our acquaintance with being, so that what we have to do is to destroy the history of Western metaphysics. That's, say, the opposite of the construction or instruction that I was talking about before. Now, when Heidegger says loosening up, as we saw last night, he's really using a word whose strict Greek equivalent would be analysis, I always want to say at this point, so much for the conflict between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. I mean, if everybody thought around it a little more, they might see a great deal more in common than they do between these activities. Derrida popularized the word deconstruction rather than the word destruction, and that seemed to be a very wise move because it echoes rather what Descartes actually says he's doing at the beginning of the Meditations, which is not so much destroying opinions as taking them out one by one from his memory, from his system of beliefs, he says, and examining them to see whether he needs to discard them, whether they can be replaced by something else, or whether he should put them back. So deconstruction is a kind of rather gentler activity than destruction, and it consists of this kind of loosening up, this analytic disarticulation of the object of this exercise. Now, it's not so much in Derrida, and that's why he doesn't think of himself, or other people don't think of him as a structuralist. Some of his earlier work was pretty structuralist around 66, but it's not so much the object of making manifest the structure of whatever it is as engaging in a practice, which is a deconstructive practice. So one understands why, although, as I say, I think deconstruction sort of conceptually emerges from structuralism, that connection wasn't seen by a lot of people, and it was thought to belong to a post-structuralist epoch. But of course, it isn't only philosophy or beliefs of that kind that get deconstructed. Texts themselves, in the first instance philosophical texts, but then later on literary texts, because they're constructed of language and yield to deconstruction, sometimes in somewhat similar ways. However, I myself would want to distinguish between this necessary analytic work of deconstruction in what looks like a much more traditional sense than one might have expected, with what it's become in literary critical practice. I take a definition of deconstruction from Barbara Johnson
She says it's the careful teasing out of the warring forces of signification within the text. Well, that's okay. I mean, it's an interesting thing to do to a literary text. You aren't really looking now at the almost moral question of Heidegger, look what's happened to Western metaphysics and so on, but you're doing something which is much more a kind of lit crit activity with a rather more limited aim. And it's not every text, of course, that will yield to that kind of thing. The texts that do always tend to have an element of self-referentiality. They turn out to be modernist or even postmodernist texts. And there aren't that many philosophical texts which are likely to yield to such things. And philosophical texts nearly always have this kind of content implicitly. But there are some, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Wittgenstein, who do seem to yield rather nicely to deconstructive practice, although there are others like Locke and Kant in which it's much more difficult. But there are special cases in literature, Sterne, Wordsworth, Poe, Joyce, Beckett, and so on, people whose texts lend themselves very nicely, and lend themselves to this kind of paradoxical unraveling that calls in question the foundations of the discursive enterprise. I myself don't think that's an activity that I would want to encourage philosophers to do with respect to their own texts, but then